Hi, good afternoon, everyone. If we haven't already met, I'm Sam, and when I'm not running around like a headless chicken trying to organize this conference, I'm occasionally a PhD student working on the connectivity of seagrass meadows in Singapore. So for today's talk, I'm going to focus on the settlement, establishment, and dislodgement processes of vegetative seagrass fragments. So as we all know, seagrasses are very important ecosystem engineers. They perform a wide range of services like coastal protection, carbon sinks, nutrient cycling. But we also know that they are in decline all over the world, and they continue to be in decline as the years go on. And one of the things that really worries us about the health of seagrass meadows is their connectivity. So we know that connectivity is important for maintaining the genetic diversity of seagrass meadows. By being connected, seagrasses meadows can exchange genetic material and become more diverse over time, which makes them more resilient against disturbances such as climate change or diseases. Now we know that seagrasses can disperse at various life stages. As seeds, they can be moved in the sediment layer, but when we think about long-distance dispersal, most people often think about sexual propagules. So we think about fruits such as those in Enhalis, which can float in the water column or on the water surface and travel vast distances. But what people don't often think about are the vegetative fragments. So seagrasses are clonal organisms. They can break off from the parent plant, and the fragments can actually regrow new shoots and new roots and actually re-establish elsewhere to form a new plant. Now, before I continue, I want to be clear about what a vegetative fragment is, because my whole talk is going to be based about that. They're basically pieces of rhizome with roots and at least one green leaf shoot. And like I've mentioned before, they can continue growing and re-establish elsewhere. So they don't necessarily have spathes or reproductive structures on them. Now, one of the reasons why I think this mechanism for long-distance dispersal is so overlooked is because it's quite hard to document in the field. So there have been several cases that have been documented, most notably by Marnie Campbell in New Zealand. But basically, it's quite hard to tell when you see a new growth appearing in the meadow where it comes from, whether it's actually from a fragment or whether it's from a seed or more often a fruit that brought the seed there, or whether it's clonal growth from adjacent meadows. But we still think that this mechanism could be potentially important, because if you think about it, seagrass meadows export huge quantities of shoots every year. A conservative estimate said 2 to 4% of shoots are exported, but it's likely to be more, and they're not limited by phenology. So unlike sexual propagules, which tend to have seasons, these can be exported year-round. So even if the chances of successful establishment is very slim, by sheer amount of materials going out, this could be actually a viable route for long-distance dispersal, particularly for meadows which are not very sexually active. And this mechanism has been used to explain the finding of identical genotypes in populations that are tens of kilometers apart. So my team is interested in modeling this movement of vegetative fragments in Singapore to see whether it could be a mode of dispersal within our meadows. And to do that, we really need to break down this whole mechanism into discrete steps. So we've done 7 steps. At the start, we have the fragment formation. So the fragment can obviously break off from the parent plant, and then it gets transported in the water column or at the water surface. And eventually it comes into contact with the substrate at a sink site. So sometimes it loses buoyancy, or maybe there's a low tide that helps it bring the fragment into contact with the sediment. It then settles, which means that it remains in contact with the substrate. It no longer floats up in the water column. And eventually it can grow roots and anchor itself and continue growing into a new plant. Of course, at any point in these 5 steps, they can decay, and that will remove them from the pool of potential dispersal agents. And after they get settled and established, they might also get dislodged by ambient hydrodynamics, which will return them to the transport pool, essentially. So for this study, we focus much more on the dislodgement, settlement, and establishment stages, because these are key to ensuring a successful dispersal. And we had several key questions that we wanted to ask. So the first was whether different species had different settlement and establishment rates, whether fragments of different ages had different settlement and establishment rates. So if they were floating in the water column for different lengths of time, did they settle or establish quicker? And after they have settled, do different species get dislodged more easily, and if they're buried under different conditions, different burial conditions, which might happen in the nearshore environment would that affect the amount of force needed to dislodge them from the sediment? So to answer the first two questions, we did a small mesocosm experiment with 3 species, Simidosia rotundata, Halophila ovalis, and Halodule uninervis, all tropical species. And we aged them for different lengths of time. So this was to simulate them being transported in the water column for different lengths of time. So we had fresh fragments, 1-week-old fragments, 2-week-old fragments, and 3-week-old fragments. And we put them in these mesocosms, which basically simulated the semi-diurnal tide that you get in Singapore, because we felt that the best chance for establishment, especially in Singapore, where most of our meadows are intertidal, would be during the low tides, because they would bring the tides would help bring the fragments in contact with the sediment. So we have 2 low tides a day, and then we cycled it for every 4 days, and we recorded the settlement and establishment over 14 days. And what we found was actually pretty interesting. So Halophila ovalis, a pioneering species, actually settled the quickest, followed by Halodule uninervis, and Simidosia rotundata didn't settle very well at all, kept floating back up. What's interesting is that they tend to settle during the low tide days, so when the tides actually brought them into contact with the sediment. And when we looked at fragments of different ages across all the species, again, quite interesting pattern. The older fragments would settle a lot quicker than the 2-week-old fragments, the 1-week-old fragments, and the fresh fragments. So this seems to show that older fragments would settle a lot quicker, and certain species have better settling capacities. And when we looked at establishment, which means they actually took root in the sediment, only one species was able to do that. So no guesses here. Our pioneering species, Halophila ovalis, was the only one in the 14 days to take root and grow. Halodule and Simidosia did not manage to do that. And when we looked at the different ages of the Halophila fragments, again we see that the older fragments would establish a lot quicker as well. But unlike settlement, establishment happens throughout the tidal regime, so it's not necessarily dependent on the low tides after it's brought into contact with the sediment. So now that we know that, in intertidal environments, it's possible for seagrasses to settle, they might still get dislodged by the hydrodynamics because there's lots of currents and waves in the nearshore environment. So we want to know whether different species have different resistance to forces that want to dislodge them. And if they are covered by sediment, which could happen, again, in the nearshore environment, there's a lot of burial going on, will that improve their chances and prevent them from being dislodged? So we did a flume experiment with this. So we ran with the 3 same species and then the 4th, the Lesser hempricii, and we put them in 4 different burial scenarios. So 3 burial scenarios, either no burial, 5mm burial, or 20mm burial. And we stuck them in this flume and basically tested how much bed shear stress was needed to pull the fragment out of the sediment. In this case, bed shear stress is the force of friction from the fluid, from the flume, acting on the body, which is the fragment in the path of that fluid. And this experimental design was based on one that was done for mangrove propagules. So, skipping ahead. So we would generate 2 different types of bed shear stress, one by currents, and we would have 6 different steps of different speeds, of different stress, and we'll see at every 2 minutes we would bump the speed up to see at which point it would just get dislodged. And then we did the same with wave-generated bed shear stress with 7 different steps. And what we found, again, was pretty interesting. So you get your pioneering species, your Halophila ovalis and Halodule uninervis, being more resistant. They required more bed shear stress to be dislodged from the sediment. And so even with no burial, you do realize that you need a bit of strength to actually, kick them up from the sediment. So that's quite interesting. That actually does help them improve their chances of settlement. And we find that with the larger species, the Lesser and Simidosia, more mid-successional species, they are more, they tend to be dislodged more easily. And of course, unsurprisingly, with deeper burial, you do require more energy, more bed shear stress to actually dislodge them. So burial is definitely helpful in keeping the seagrasses down. So this was with current generated bed shear stress. When we did it with waves, interestingly, for species, there was no difference. So maybe it's the orbital movement for the different species that doesn't seem to affect how much energy is needed to dislodge them from the sediment. But obviously, burial, again, is helpful in helping them stay in the sand. So what does this all mean if you take it together? Because it's quite a lot to take in. Basically, we know that older fragments settle and establish quicker, and that's good. So basically, they get to travel, the older they are, they get to travel for a longer distance. Basically, if they can travel around for 3 weeks, they can move to move over a much larger distance. But obviously, they can't travel indefinitely because eventually they'll decay. So there might be an optimal period whereby, an optimal age by which they actually settle and establish the best. And we know that low tides might actually help them bring the fragments in contact with the substrate, which again will improve the chances of establishment and settlement. And lastly, burial seems to help with preventing dislodgement. So that again might improve the chances of settlement and establishment. So all of these put together gives you a window of opportunity, as my supervisor Chair likes to say, whereby settlement and establishment would be the best. So we are trying to model that hydrodynamically, and hopefully we get some interesting results to see where all fragments are going. Now, there are some implications on the different strategies that the species are using. So it seems clear that pioneering species like Halophila ovalis, they're small species. They settle and establish quickly. They are harder to dislodge, but they also won't travel as far because they settle quicker. So there might be a trade-off with species that can travel a bit further, especially with more with more stores in their rhizomes. But then they have a lower chance of settling and establishing elsewhere. When we are modeling all of this, we also acknowledge that there are other factors that might affect this whole process. So things like existing substrate complexity. If you have an existing meadow, that might help to trap the fragments to the sediment, improve chances of settlement. And of course, you have organisms that bioturbate that might dislodge, but might also bury. So it's hard to tell which way it goes. So if you haven't been paying attention, that's fine. I know lunch is coming up. You're all hungry. 3 main takeaway points. Number 1, seagrasses can disperse via vegetative fragments. And some species and older fragments can settle and establish quicker than others. And burial seems to play a crucial role in preventing dislodgement. Thank you.
And perfect timing. Okay, questions?
Really interesting, Samantha.
Thank you.
I'm always struggling with the establishment component, and you showed very clearly that one of the species established.
Yeah.
Have you any other evidence that the other two established something, even if they're not?
I know it was a short period of time, so unfortunately not yet. I like to think that maybe given a longer period of time with more fragments, I think we might be able to make it work because it was quite a small sample size. We do know that they lose buoyancy over time, and that brings them close to the sediment, but we haven't managed to see any of them actually take root. Yeah, so not as yet, but I think it might be possible with a longer period of time and maybe a larger sample size. Because I do know this is a numbers game. You throw a whole bunch of fragments out and most of them will not settle or establish. It's probably not the best way of dispersing, but because of the amount of material going out, it might be a viable option for some of them. So, I'm sorry, that's the best answer I can give at the moment. Yes.
One quick question.
Yeah.
With this thought of establishment, especially Singapore and Malaysia, it's a big question that when you talk about window of opportunity, we do have a southwestern monsoon.
Yes.
So it's not necessarily all year round success. It would depend on the aspect of the seagrass bed in relation to the prevailing monsoon condition at the time.
Yeah, so we are putting this in a model. So our model, it's based on DHI Mike 3D system, and they actually have all that information in. So the northwest over the year, how the currents and waves are moving. So that would take into account the monsoon seasons. Yeah. So hopefully we'll see something interesting from that.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.